love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 11. The New Field Offered to Hope. Hello, husband.
Bonjour, mademoiselle.
Oh, the international flavor here.
I didn't see that many terms for Jane this chapter, but we do see her referred to as mademoiselle a couple of times by little Adele.
Little Adele.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is a major moment now. We finally get to Thornfield Hall.
Yeah.
We get to see where Jane will be living for some time.
I know we alluded to it on the previous episode, but this is, to me, kind of like where Jane Eyre begins. Mm-hmm. You know, you and I have watched as many possible film and TV adaptations
as I could find, yes.
As you could find, yes. And I feel like you also showed me some really interesting live TV adaptations from the 1950s, where there were only an hour. You got to tell Jane Eyre in an hour, and almost all of them start here.
Right.
This is her showing up. It's always her showing up at Thornfield as an adult. They don't bother to show her, you know, her experience at Lowood. So now we're getting into this, like I said, the meat of the story and what is sort of the beginning of the story in a handful of adaptations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just get right into what happens in chapter 11, according to the SparkNotes summary. Jane's driver is late picking her up from the station at Millcote. When she finally arrives at Thornfield, it is nighttime. Although she cannot distinguish much of the house's facade from among the shadows, she finds the interior cozy and agreeable. Mrs. Fairfax, a prim elderly woman, is waiting for Jane. It turns out that Mrs. Fairfax is not, as Jane had assumed from their correspondence, the owner of Thornfield, but rather the housekeeper. Thornfield's owner, Mr. Rochester, travels regularly and leaves much of the manor's management to Mrs. Fairfax. Jane learns that she will be tutoring Adele, an 8-year-old French girl whose mother was a singer and dancer. Mrs. Fairfax also tells Jane about Rochester, saying that he is an eccentric man whose family has a history of extreme and violent behavior. Suddenly, Jane hears a peal of strange, eerie laughter echoing through the house, and Mrs. Fairfax summons someone named Grace, whom she orders to make less noise and to remember directions. When Grace leaves, Mrs. Fairfax explains that she is a rather unbalanced and unpredictable seamstress who works in the house. So SparkNotes is setting up some of the eeriness of Thornfield, which I feel like in this chapter I don't really get that much of a sense of, other than the strange peal of laughter that she hears. But I also think it's funny that just right at the beginning of this summary, it makes a point of mentioning that Jane's driver is late picking her up. It's just calling him out already, but I guess in a way it just highlights that this is sort of a uncertain thing for Jane to do, to take a job without any recommendation and go to a place she's unfamiliar with. It could be a little scary for her.
By the expedient of placing an advertisement in the county newspaper, I had secured a competency as a governess. My pupil was to be one little girl of 9 years, and my salary, £30 per annum. The place was called Thornfield, in Yorkshire. I considered myself independent at last.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, she's going through this change, and yet I like how it's kind of drawn out. Like, she's not there yet.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's another extra moment for her to contemplate, and I just feel like it adds a lot of extra anxiety to an already nervous situation. So, I mean, call that drama, call it what you will, but it's interesting that Charlotte chose to do that, where it's like, rather than just showing her, you know, arriving at Thornfield, instead it's like, oh no, he's late.
Yeah,
so you're
and
like,
she has to wait around.
Yeah, and she's got to kind of
look around,
kind of have to decide, like, oh, okay, what am I doing? Am I really doing this? Am I really taking this job, like you said, without recommendation? It's some town and a place that she's not familiar with. So yeah, and I feel like, as we've discovered in the first 10 chapters of this book, Jane's in her head a lot. And so this is just kind of adds to that. And it's just another moment for her to get a little bit introspective and kind of realize the momentous decision that she's made and the next chapter, but her next chapter in her life is about to begin. Yeah.
It also seems like, we've gone through these 10 chapters, and this chapter, I feel like, has a lot more description, a lot more character description than previous chapters, where she's really dwelling on these new surroundings, which I like. I mean, I feel like it really does set up that this is going to be an important part of Jane's life right now.
Yeah, and in a weird way, kind of like with those TV adaptations, this could be the first chapter in the book.
Oh, sure.
You know? It's so, like I said, it's very vivid. There's that word we use a lot with the way Charlotte writes these things. Very vivid. We get a very vivid description of her traveling with all the different rolling hills. I love that part. I love where, because I can picture that. I mean, like I said, I was fortunate enough to go up to the moors of England on our honeymoon. You took me up there.
Went to the Bronte parsonage.
Yeah, and so, but at the same time, I think I told you this off the air, that it's very detailed, but it was also kind of difficult for me to get the exact image in my mind, because I've never been to these types of manors and castles and stuff.
Right.
You have been. You could tell me more about that. But it was like I'm only drawing on images that I've seen in movies or my grandmother's house or something like that. But she goes into such detail describing the doorways and the doorknobs and stuff like that, and you're like, okay, I'm starting to picture it a little bit in my head, but of course now rereading it, having seen 12, 14, 16 adaptations, you kind of have an idea of now I got an idea of what it probably looks like. But I mean, it's easier for you. Like I said, you've been to one of the halls with that Thornfield is based on, right? Or that.
Well, it's not based on it, but it's been Thornfield Hall in 3 adaptations. Okay. Haddon Hall, which I think is my favorite. I've also been to Renishaw Hall, which is Thornfield in the 1973 miniseries, which is my favorite. The outside of Renishaw is just beautiful, like beautiful gardens, and I can totally picture that as being Thornfield. But Haddon Hall has a little bit more of a forbidding look to it, and it's also really gorgeous. And I think now when I read Jane Eyre and think about Thornfield, it's more Haddon Hall that I see.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, and the rooms there are particular rooms that they seem to like to use for different parts of Jane Eyre, and I recognize them. And one day I hope that when we can travel freely and safely, then we can go back and go to Haddon Hall, and I'll show you around there, and I'm sure there's lots of other manors and castles that we can visit.
Yeah, it makes you long for a place like that. I know it's not very common in America.
That we
have, but I know I'll mention this right now because I we haven't really talked about it on the show before. But the first time I read this book, I told Charlene, I said that would be a cool life, in a weird way.
Oh,
like I said, when Charlene and I get older, maybe we could go move to England, and then we could just be a butler
and a
housekeeper at a castle where you live on site. You don't need a salary because your expenses are all paid for. So it's like it would be kind
salary's
of
not that important.
Yeah, it would be kind of a neat way to live, where you're just taking care of this old house.
Oh, well, now I wouldn't mind being a docent of a Haddon Hall or something, where I'm just like, well, I don't know about leading tours, but just maintaining the grounds and decorating for the holidays. It would be so much fun. Yeah. It's just so beautiful there.
But does this chapter pull you in? I mean, especially maybe the first time or the several times after you read it, does it grab you in? Or do you see yourself in this building where the descriptions, you can picture them more clearly in your head?
I think now, I mean, it has been so many years that I've been rereading this book, so I think it does help that I have seen these adaptations, so I've already kind of have my own picture of Thornfield Hall. I can't really remember the very first time I read it, and if I was more trying to get to the meat of the story of okay, there's a lot of descriptions, but let's see who these people are. So, for instance, we get introduced to Mrs. Fairfax.
Mrs. Fairfax. What did you think of Mrs. Fairfax? We know this character is going to play a key role. Mm-hmm. She's the next. She's not the mentor, the Miss Temple-like figure, because she's a completely different subset of she's not supposed to be there to teach. She's supposed to be there to just kind of guide and be this sage,
like a companion.
And so what are your first impressions now that we've finally met her?
Yeah, I think Mrs. Fairfax is coming off as very motherly and welcoming, and that's very important to Jane, especially since, again, she's in a situation that's very new to her. Could be a little scary.
She didn't get that from Mrs. Reed.
No. So yeah, that's probably a little alien to Jane, but like Mrs. Temple, and Miss Fairfax is very welcoming and motherly, like I said. So I find it a little interesting that Jane doesn't seem to warm to her as much as she did Miss Temple. At least initially, maybe it's because Jane is unsure of Mrs. Fairfax's status. You know, she thought that she might be the proprietor of Thornfield or the owner, but it turns out that Miss Fairfax is just the housekeeper, so that they're more on a level.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Fairfax doesn't seem to offer as much stimulating conversation as Miss Temple, so maybe that's also why Jane is not immediately as enamored. I don't know. I get that young Jane is very enamored of Miss Temple, and Miss Fairfax is just a nice person that Jane is getting to know.
Yeah, and I also think, like you said, Miss Temple is there to teach her. And so I think a lot of children probably look up to their teachers in that regard.
True.
You know, whereas this is just someone who's at this building. Like, at this point, you know, Jane is just being introduced to her, so she doesn't really know, like you said, like, what is her role in this building? Yeah. And so, you know, I thought I was drawn to the fact that Jane points out many times how uncomfortable she's felt because she's getting all this attention, not used to having things taken care of for her, you know, considering her last, well, I mean, maybe Mrs. Reed might have taken care of her in some regard, but not Lowood. She didn't really have a lot.
Right.
And so I actually want to bring up one of the first quotes that kind of stuck with me in this chapter. And this is after Mrs. Fairfax has started to show Jane around, and Jane like I said, she's starting to feel a little uncomfortable. Jane says, quote, "I felt rather confused at being the object of more attention than I had ever before received, and that too, shown by my employer and superior. But as she did not herself seem to consider she was doing anything out of her place, I thought it better to take her civilities quietly."
Right.
So it's sometimes
just go with the flow.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, right. It's like sometimes they say it's better to give than receive, but then sometimes it's just like it's okay to just sit back and receive.
Yeah.
Receive a gift. Don't feel like you have to get somebody another gift in return.
People reciprocate.
People want to share that, pass that on, you know. And then, like you mentioned, Jane considers her an equal as soon as she finds out that she's just the housekeeper, right? And it's kind of it was a clever part of the chapter. But there's something I wanted to kind of draw attention to, and I don't know if you've ever dealt with this, because I kind of have, and that is Miss Fairfax points out that she doesn't really spend time with the staff, doesn't really converse with them that closely, because, you know, and I'll bring up another quote here. She's referring to some of the other members of the staff, Leah, for example, and she says, quote, Leah is a nice girl to be sure, and John and his wife are very decent people, but then you see they are only servants, and one can't converse with them on terms of equality. One must keep them at due distance for fear of losing one's authority. And that really rang true with me, because that has come up in my professional life, like within the last 5, 6, 7 years, and I didn't realize it would. I had jobs previously where you hung out with everybody, and I remember one of my previous jobs, like the first week that I was there, they all invited me out for like a happy hour, and there was like 10 of us at this bar at happy hour, and we were all, some people were managers and some people were just like coordinators, and it was like, oh, this must be what it's like, you know, especially those first few jobs I got in Los Angeles out of college, where you're all just buddies because you're all about the same age. And then there was a lot of drama that kind of ensued out of that. And I've learned that when I got to my next job, I specifically made it a point, I didn't necessarily hang out with my boss. And I would get invited, he would invite me out for like birthday parties that he was throwing at bars. And I said, no, it's just, I'm going to keep my distance.
Oh, yeah.
He quit his job, moved away to Detroit, and when I was in Detroit, I went and saw him. We had a great time. We hung out and had dinner.
Now you can be friends.
Yeah, we can be friends. And I used to always, and it's like social media. I wasn't friends on Facebook with a lot of my close coworkers. If they worked on the other side of the building or in a different building on the studio lot, okay. But if I had people that were like in the cube next to me that would try to add me on like Facebook, for example, and I said, I can't. I don't want to do that. It's too weird. I don't need my boss or someone near me knowing when I'm on it or not, you know. And I'll tell you just a real quick story. There was a few years ago, I have a cousin named Jimmy who's in the Navy, and he was stationed down in San Diego, which is about 2 hours south of here. And there was one year that I didn't go home for Christmas. And so he was like, why don't you come down and see me and my wife and kids, and we'll have dinner here. And I went down there, and his wife was explaining how like she was really bored. They'd been there for a year or so, and she's like, I don't really get to do anything. I'm here kind of with the kids. And I said, oh, well, you know, are there any other, wives or any other, Navy wives you can hang out with or girlfriends or something? And she was like, no, he was an officer. And so he had enlisted guys under him. And she's like, I can't hang out with the enlisted people's wives. Oh, wow. And he can't hang out with the enlisted. It's too weird. And it was interesting to see it brought up in a book written in 1847 that we have a character saying, I can't talk to them because you're going to lose your authority. Right. And that's something that I feel like, I don't know when that happens. I don't know when that hits a lot of people. It didn't hit me till I was in my mid 30s. Because usually when you're in your later 20s, you're just like, oh yeah, my boss is really cool. And maybe the boss wants to buddy up with you. Mm-hmm. And then when you get older, you kind of realize, I don't think I should be doing this. Because you need to be able to, if someone's going to screw around and then you try to admonish them for it, they'll just be like, oh, but this is, right? And so I thought I liked how Miss Fairfax was like, no, I don't talk to them. I have to be, I'm the one that runs this house. Yeah. They have to see me as an authority figure. And she puts that out immediately so that Jane has an idea of how to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's also a situation that was very common at that time, especially for governesses, because they were in this weird position where they weren't really a servant, but they were definitely not part of the family. I feel, and if you read Jane Eyre more, the way that Jane Eyre is treated, I don't know if that's necessarily the way all governesses were treated. I feel like sometimes they were left a little bit on their own and sort of ignored other than what they did for the kids. So Jane Eyre might have had it a little bit better than other governesses at that time.
Well, of course, Mrs. Fairfax is not the only person that we get introduced to in this chapter. We also get another new character, a nouveau personnage, if you will. And that is, of course, little Adele Varens. Mm-hmm. Same with Mrs. Fairfax. I'll ask you again, what was your first impressions of little Adele?
Well, she's a child, so you get a sense of just that she has a lot of energy, and she's very interested in this new person in her life, because I'm sure she doesn't have a lot of people that comes in and out of her life in the remote location she's in. You get a hint of a tragic backstory, but I found it interesting that Jane doesn't really press Adele to learn more about like what happened to her mother and why Mr. Rochester took her in. Mm-hmm. So there's sort of a interesting lack of curiosity in Jane that she doesn't try to ask more of Adele. Yeah. But Adele is just full of energy and bouncy and probably just such a different type of person than young Jane was.
Well, or any of the inmates at Lowood.
True. Yeah. Well, they're all downtrodden there probably.
They couldn't stand out, right?
Yeah.
They would have, if they stuck their head out, they would have gotten pushed back down by Brocklehurst and whatnot. I always wonder if if maybe Jane doesn't really try to ask too many questions of her because Adele is so full of personality in a way. I feel like she's going to find out eventually. Like Adele is going to keep telling stories, and because she's kind of larger than life in this chapter. Where it's we've been introduced to Helen, and we've been introduced to John Reed and all these other characters. But then when Adele shows up, Adele's just like, here's who I am. Yeah. I'm going to sing you a song. I'm going to read you a poem.
I want to dance for you now.
I'm going to dance for you. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, with Jane not taking a lot of interest in her, or at least not wanting to just barrage her with questions. Maybe you don't want to do that with a 6-year-old? Is that what she is? 6?
8.
8. Okay.
Is she 8? Yeah, I believe she's 8.
Okay. But is she worried that would it maybe kind of like the authority thing with Mrs. Fairfax? Is Jane worried that if she gets to know her too well, it might maybe not affect her teaching? She doesn't want to be too much of a friend. Mm-hmm. She wants her to be taken seriously as this governess. Yeah. And so she could have some sort of authority over her, Or at the same time, but is she also trying to be less nosy because she's acclimating herself to these new surroundings? This is a big moment for her, right?
Yeah, maybe people don't want to see that she's asking so many questions.
Yeah. Jane has always seemed like an inquisitive person, but at the same time, it's like, okay, it's a big building. There's a handful of people who work here. Maybe she's like, I'll eventually get to know them all. Yeah, what's the sense in doing it all on the first day?
She does ask more questions of Miss Fairfax, especially about her new employer, Mr. Rochester, that she didn't know was her employer. Mm-hmm. And I find it funny because Jane's first response to Mrs. Fairfax being surprised that she didn't know that her employer was Mr. Rochester or who Mr. Rochester was, Jane says, Of course I did not. I had never heard of him before, but the old lady seemed to regard his existence as a universally understood fact with which everybody must be acquainted by instinct. And I just think that's, it sounds a little annoyed and sarcastic to me. I don't know about, that seems like that's Jane's tone to you.
Well, I mean, again, I wonder if Miss Fairfax just absentmindedly did not mention Rochester in the,
she
correspondence.
I thought, yeah.
Right? She just says, we need a governess in this building, and this is how old your student's going to be.
In the ward of the owner of this place.
Yeah, but
I guess since Mr. Rochester's not there, maybe Mrs. Fairfax didn't even think of it.
Yeah, and like I said, and maybe it's funny if it's like Adele, maybe he's larger than life as well too. Like, as we're going to learn, he's this eligible bachelor, this ladies' man, and I wonder if his reputation is known all over town. And maybe she just assumes that everybody who comes through there knows who Mr. Rochester is, even if Jane has been in some institution teaching. Yeah. Maybe Fairfax assumes that, oh, you must have heard of him by now, and so, or maybe she just doesn't want to draw attention to it. Maybe one of the previous governesses developed a crush on Mr. Rochester, and she doesn't want that to happen again.
That's terrible. Why would Miss Fairfax want to block potential love? No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, what if the previous governess was like 20 years younger than Mr. Rochester? That would be kind of weird.
I don't know. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's that weird.
Yeah.
But there's another quote that I find funny that Jane, so she's asking more questions of Mrs. Fairfax, and she tries to get a little bit more of an idea of who Mr. Rochester is, and she says, "This was all the account I got from Mrs. Fairfax of her employer and mine. There are people who seem to have no notion of sketching a character or observing and describing salient points, either in persons or things. The good lady evidently belonged to this class. My queries puzzled, but did not draw her out. Mr. Rochester was Mr. Rochester in her eyes, a gentleman, a landed proprietor, nothing more. She inquired and searched no further, and evidently wondered at my wish to gain a more definite notion of his identity." So it's Jane making this point that there's two kinds of people who know how to describe people and understand their character and can describe their salient points, or people who just can't really do that. And it seems that Mrs. Fairfax is in the class where she can't really describe people, but Jane does seem to be in the class of people who know how to sketch a character, and that makes her a great narrator for us.
Oh yeah, she's sketching the door handles and the doorways of this building. I also wonder if Mrs. Fairfax, maybe she's tired of talking about him. Because she probably has to answer for him a lot.
Oh, well, I was going to say, Mrs. Fairfax, she probably likes to talk, I would think.
Well, I mean,
maybe not gossip as much then. Like, she doesn't want to just go on and on about someone, her employer like that, because it's inappropriate.
That's true.
Yeah.
And, and they are related. But yeah, she seems like she's more prim and proper. And I wonder if, like I said, if they don't get a lot of visitors there, but every visitor that shows up is asking about Rochester. And she's just like, okay, he's over here. Now he's in France. Now he's in Kingston, Jamaica. Now he's here, so then she finally gets this governess. Great, I got this governess. She's going to teach this ward, get her out of my hair. And then all the governess is doing is, who's Mr. Rochester? Who's Mr. Rochester? And she's just kind of like, he's this guy.
It doesn't matter.
You might meet him at some point.
Yeah.
He's barely ever here. Just, get to know me and the staff. But don't get to know them too well, because we have to have authority over them.
Well, I wanted to mention another example of foreshadowing. I feel like it's been a little bit of time since we've had this moment of foreshadowing. Charlotte Bronte likes to drop in. And there's a description of the third-story hallway when Mrs. Fairfax is taking Jane around Thornfield and giving her the tour, which, as we have mentioned, Jane describes pretty well what Thornfield looks like. And she mentions about the third story that it is like a corridor in some Bluebeard's castle. And that's definitely an important piece of foreshadowing, which, if you don't know the story...
I do not.
I don't want to spoil it, but I just want to point out that that's a fun little Easter egg. And I hope that maybe at some point I'll have you read the actual fairy tale. Since you don't know it.
No,
right?
no. Is there some sort of supernatural elements in that? Is there some gothic?
So the whole Bluebeard No. You got nothing.
I got nothing. Blackbeard.
Blackbeard, sure.
I think there was a movie called Yellowbeard when I was a kid that was a comedy film, but Bluebeard I'm not.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe I'll have you read that.
I'm a Bluebeard, I'm a Bluebeard. No?
That's not quite how the song goes.
No, Paul McCartney.
I will, I'll have you read that fairy tale and report back on what you think.
Okay.
Obviously it's very short, so it won't take too much time.
Okay. Yeah, and like you said, the laughter, the unnerving laughter is more foreshadowing. And
it's the Gothic element.
Well, yeah.
Coming into play.
So and I know it's one of the things that I'm really, really enjoying about this second reread first reread, my initial rereading of the book.
Yeah.
That it's stuff that I probably didn't pay too much attention to the first time around. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's dropped in at the very end of the chapter, so it's one of the last things you're thinking about when you wrap up. Mm-hmm. Is that there's this laughter, but then you're like, oh, okay, there's this woman named Grace that's working here, and okay, that's all we need to know.
Yeah,
and it's just like, but at the same time, I'm sure if I would have told you, if you'd have checked in on me after every chapter I read the first time, and I had to come back and I said, oh yeah, I just read chapter 10 and there was some unnerving laughter at the end, I would imagine you'd have been like the cat who ate the canary, and you'd just been like, you just can't wait for you to get to the point where you're like, who's the laughter coming from, and why is it such an important part of the story? Because I'm thinking when I read it the first time, I probably, like I said, I didn't probably give it much thought.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I'm probably the same when I first read it, where, I mean, maybe I thought, oh, that's kind of weird. Like, I wonder what that is all about. But yeah, it's going to take a while for the reader to find out what that laughter means. So we have the first extensive description of what Jane looks like in this chapter 2, which I think is really interesting. I'm going to quote what Jane says. She says, "It was not my habit to be disregardful of appearance or careless of the impression I made. On the contrary, I ever wished to look as well as I could and to please as much as my want of beauty would permit. I sometimes regretted that I was not handsomer. I sometimes wished to have rosy cheeks, a straight nose, and small cherry mouth. I desired to be tall, stately, and finely developed in figure. I felt it a misfortune that I was so little, so pale, and had features so irregular and so marked." And I think that I wanted to give a little context about the way that Charlotte decided to craft a heroine and a hero who is not particularly good looking, because her biographer, Elizabeth Gaskell, has Charlotte quoted as saying to her sisters that they were wrong, even morally wrong, in making their heroines beautiful as a matter of course. They replied that it was impossible to make a heroine interesting on any other terms. Her answer was, "I will prove to you that you are wrong. I will show you a heroine as plain and as small as myself, who shall be as interesting as any of yours." So I think that's great of Charlotte to decide that, even though it was very common in romances today and at that time to have heroes and heroines very beautiful or handsome, Charlotte decides, I'm going to add more realism to the story by showing that people who think of themselves as plain or insignificant, they have a very full and vibrant personality, and that makes them very attractive to others, because I think it gives Jane a lot more depth.
Yeah, and it was something I know we talked about on the last episode, which was, Charlotte had worked as a governess and as a teacher, and so you write what you know.
Yeah, and so I think Charlotte also thought of herself as plain.
Yeah, right. I wonder if when she was a teenager going through that time, if she was not getting attention as much, and so she probably is writing that whole part about, the inner monologue you just had from Jane, where she said, I wish that, I was sometimes had rosy cheeks or a straight nose. I wonder if Charlotte had thought that herself as well. Like we have very differing views on what Charlotte looked like. Unfortunately, there's just a few drawings here, there's
some artists painted her at that time, and I think they might have tried to make her look a little more beautiful or conventionally beautiful, just to make it more appealing to people. Because
I feel like there's a couple of drawings of her that are the ones you commonly see. Mm-hmm. In the 5 years that we've known each other, I feel like I've seen the same drawing of Charlotte. I think we've got a refrigerator magnet with that drawing on it when we were at the Bronte parsonage. But then we watched there was a movie that I guess it aired on PBS here in America called To Walk Invisible, all about the Bronte sisters. And the woman they cast as Charlotte is a little smaller, short, petite, mousy, had glasses, dark hair.
Yeah.
All the paintings I've ever seen of Charlotte, she had like reddish colored hair, didn't she? Or brown, at least brunette. No.
Yeah, she was, she had like
but like a lighter brown versus the actress. I'm curious when they cast, when you make a biopic about somebody in recent memory that oh, I know what Ray Charles looks like. I know what Muhammad Ali looks like. Okay. Whereas when you're like, okay, all we have is drawings of Charlotte Bronte.
Well, I think this will be interesting for you to know that there's actually hair from Charlotte Bronte and her sisters, because in Victorian times, when people died, they used to do these things called mourning rings, where they put pieces of locks of their hair in these rings, kind of plates. So you know that Charlotte Bronte, you have an idea of what her hair color was. Anne Bronte's hair was lighter, I believe, a little more reddish, and I just think that's fascinating that we have that mementos from them.
Yeah,
so you kind of do get a sense of what their hair color was,
and we could use it to clone them.
Oh gosh!
And then we could make a theme park with a bunch of random Victorian England era authors running around, and we could call it Jurassic Park.
I think I inspired a little something weird right now.
that has to be a thing. Someone needs to write that book.
Well, before we move on to the last segment of our podcast, I wanted to show you a little something that I found maybe a few years ago, where this website would do these composite or police sketch drawings of literary characters based on the description of the character in the books. And they did a version of Jane Eyre, they did a version of Mr. Rochester, but for now, I'm just going to show you Jane Eyre, and this will be your first time you ever seen this, and just give me your reaction of what you think this basically mugshot of Jane looks like to you.
Okay. Ooh, va va voom. That's kind of like that. She just said she doesn't want to have a longer nose, right? But that nose does kind of look...
She does seem like a longer nose than I would have thought Jane would have. And just such a kind of dour expression.
Yeah.
Where she's a little bit intimidating or something. But I'm going to post this picture on the my Instagram at Air Guide, so you can see it as well.
She looks very Eastern European.
Oh, interesting.
Stern look on her face.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I don't really see this as much as an accurate Jane.
Yeah. I feel like I had a crush on that girl in high school and she shot me down.
Oh, well, she looks like she would shoot people down.
Oh, I shouldn't feel so bad.
But anyways, so then I guess next chapter we'll do Mr. Rochester. When he gets introduced, I'll show you that picture of him it's from a blog that was called The Composites. Just wanted to give the credit to them.
That's a cool endeavor. I'm glad somebody did that.
Yeah, actually, it is interesting to go through their site and look at these drawings of all these different characters.
Especially when these books have been adapted so many times, and at a certain level, like I don't know if this was the case with you, but I'm sure that there are people out there who read Jane Eyre. Maybe they read it around the time of the last theatrical adaptation, or maybe afterwards, and so they're always going to see Mia Wasikowska.
Yeah,
when they read Jane. I guess it's always the problem of watching a movie before you read a book, right?
Yeah.
It's like you have an image in your head.
Yeah, I like to read the book before I watch the movie.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know if it's because I went to film school, but sometimes I would cast the movies in my head.
Oh, that seems like
rather than
fun.
Because it's easier to picture somebody. I'll read a book and I'll be like, oh, I can see Nicole Kidman in that part or Sandra Bullock in that role. I don't think when I read Jane Eyre, I had not seen any of the film adaptations. I don't know who I was picturing. I don't know if I was picturing Kirsten Dunst or Anna Paquin or somebody. Yeah, I'd have to go. I mean, it was 5 years ago when I read it the first time, so I'm curious to see if there was somebody who I thought. Or did you just look at the picture on the cover of the various books? Charlene has a lot of copies of Jane Eyre, so I'm sure I've seen illustrations of her before I finished reading it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll wrap up, as we always do, by looking at a very meaningful passage or quote from the chapter that meant a lot to us. And so, Charlene, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so my quote comes from Mrs. Fairfax, again mentioning how she's not very good at describing people. And she has this to say about Mr. Rochester. Jane is asking her more questions about what is his character like. And she says, I don't know. It is not easy to describe. Nothing striking, but you feel it when he speaks to you. You cannot be always sure if whether he is in jest or earnest, whether he is pleased or the contrary. You don't thoroughly understand him, in short. At least I don't, but it is of no consequence. He is a very good master. So what I like about that quote is that you get to see, at least from Mrs. Fairfax's side, that Mr. Rochester is a little bit of an enigma. to some people at least. And I feel like Jane can be an enigma to some people because Jane is quiet and reticent and doesn't really speak up to people around her. So, maybe Mr. Rochester and Jane, they're a little bit more of a match than a little indication that they are well matched because people don't understand them as well, but they can understand each other.
Ooh, deep. No, it is pretty interesting. Like from an enigmatic standpoint, like you said, this is when you read this book, most likely you probably have read the Dust Jacket if you've never read it before. And so I'm sure I had heard the phrase Rochester. Like, I don't know if I would have known the name before I had the book. Maybe, like, I'm really big on trivia, and so I can't remember. I'm sure I've heard of Mr. Darcy. I've heard of some of these characters that are sort of famous. Heathcliff and Catherine, is it?
Yeah, Kathy.
And so, like, I know that more from the Monty Python sketch, but that is pretty cool the way that if we still haven't met him yet. But yet, you know his name, you know who he is based on the book, or if someone's given you the book, they've told you, oh, it's about Jane Rochester, and so like that's one of the first descriptions you get is just it's very vague, and it makes him kind of like you said this really larger than life persona that you're looking forward to when you finally do see him. Yeah, what he's how close he is to the way Fairfax describes him.
Yes. Okay. So what's your quote?
Well, my quote, I think in the last chapter, I know I had a quote about Jane's new beginning and how she couldn't sleep the night before. I think that was how excited she was. And so my quote for this chapter was very similar. It has a lot to do with new beginnings and the excitement that you have. And so this is after Mrs. Fairfax has shown Jane around the house and leaves her to her devices. Quote, "When Mrs. Fairfax had bidden me a kind good night, and I had fastened my door, gazed leisurely around, and in some measure effaced the eerie impression made by that wide hall, that dark and spacious staircase, and that long, cold gallery, by the livelier aspect of my little room, I remembered that, after a day of bodily fatigue and mental anxiety, I was now at last in safe haven." And that one stuck with me a lot, was I was now at last in safe haven, because even in the vastness of this huge manor, it's different enough from the last two places that she was at that she can truly enjoy it. There's no spoiled, nagging children and their mean mother like there was at Gateshead. There's no malnutrition, disease, and insufferable conditions of Lowood. It's this huge place. And it's just like, okay, this is mine now. This is not.
She gets her own little room too.
Yeah, she has her own room. She has a job. She has someone to look after, and so that's why I'm not surprised the way that Charlotte describes the minute detail of the house, because I'm sure that's what Jane was doing too, and she's going around and she's looking, just taking it all in, because knowing, like I said, how many adventures am I going to have here? Sure. How many opportunities am I going to have here? What great experiences am I going to experience here? And so I did like that. I was now at last in safe haven, because Lord knows Jane needs a safe haven after the first 10 chapters of the book.
We're happy for Jane.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that is the end of our podcast. And this is going to come out right before the Christmas holidays. So I just wanted to wish everyone very safe and warm, happy holidays. And thank you so much again for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.